Womanjaka. Welcome to the Expert Connections webinars, which are part of the Climate Change and Environment program. My name is Kate Phillips and I'm the Senior Curator of Science and the Environment at Museums Victoria. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects, my deep respects, to elders past and present. And I would like to recognise the First Peoples community members who are ongoing custodians of the platypus and the land and the water that it lives in. Our program today, Platypus and a Changing Environment, what is needed to help populations thrive in future, is the first in a series of webinars which are part of the Climate Change and Environment program. It's supported by Inspiring Australia, and we have wonderful partners in this program. We have Neighbourhood Houses Victoria, the Royal Society of Victoria, and of course Museums Victoria. So please do have a look at the website if you want to find out more about this project. This program is responding to the fact that the impacts of climate change are already here. And people around the world agree that we need to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts, as expressed in the Sustainable Development Goal number 13. The positive news is that there are many ways that we can do this, from the community, from the personal level to the community level to the national and international level. And this collaboration is about understanding, discussing and acting on climate change. And I'd like to thank Petro Zalakis from Neighbourhood Houses Victoria for these wonderful slides here, these squares that just remind us some of the many different ways that we can take climate action. Today's talk is also related to the Sustainable Development Goal, Life on Land, number 15. And we're focused on an animal that lives in rivers and streams, which are really interesting environments because they are influenced by the landscape all around them. And so, in a way, reflect the health of the whole landscape. Looking at the health of environments on a broad level in Australia, there's a recent paper out by Dana Bergstrom and her co-authors that highlights many ecosystems that are at peril of collapsing. The paper also gives a prescription on how to respond. And it's worth noting that in every different ecosystem, there are specific actions relevant to that particular situation, as well as one common one, global climate action, which is needed for them all. It is the common denominator. Today is a wonderful opportunity to hear from scientists who've developed a deep expertise through research over time. We have two speakers, and then we have time for some written questions from the audience. Please do write your questions and put them in the Q&A box. You'll find that in the Zoom controls, and that's where you can write your questions. Now to our first speaker. Dr. Melody Serena has been researching platypus since 1989. Including live trapping surveys of more than half of Victoria's river basins. She's often called upon for her expertise on platypus habitat assessment and restoration. Melody has studied platypus behaviour, how long they live, when they breed, how they move in the landscape, and she's developed methods for community-based visual platypus monitoring and established the Australian Platypus Monitoring Network. Welcome, Melody.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to speak about my very favorite species. And to start, I just need to share screen, so just hang on a tick. The platypus is certainly one of the world's most unusual animals, and I could speak for literally hours about all of its interesting features. But today I want to focus on what's known about the platypus's conservation needs based on recent scientific studies. In the first half of the talk, I'll be focusing on knowledge that's been gained through studies mainly of behavior. And in the second half, Richard will be focusing on the knowledge that's been gained by studying the platypus's food supply and how it actually eats. Now, first I want to provide you with some general background. The platypus does only occur in Australia. It's widespread in reliably flowing river systems in Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. And you can see that illustrated by the blue on the map here. Just for your interest, that dot, that isolated blue dot in Queensland is actually the area around Carnarvon Gorge. The top of the range, the upper part of the range in Queensland is probably limited by crocodiles, saltwater crocodiles. The species historically occurred only in very low numbers in South Australia, and even at the time of European settlement, and it is probably no longer found there apart from a small introduced population on Kangaroo Island, which you can see is that kind of pink, bright pink dot. It's also found on King Island in Bass Strait, dating from when a land bridge connected Tasmania to the mainland. Across this range, the platypus is considered to be a habitat generalist. It occurs from sea level right up to the top of the Australian Alps. And for example, a few years ago, a juvenile platypus was recovered from the helipad at Falls Creek Ski Resort, where it obviously had moved in the wrong direction uphill from a stream. It inhabits both running waters, such as creeks and rivers, and also still waters, including man-made reservoirs. Having said that, some types of habitats are definitely preferred by the platypus over others. To identify their favorite habitat features, animals can be fitted with miniature radio transmitter tags as shown at left. These are actually, in practice, these are, as you can see, there's a tiny little battery and a little transmitter, which is the black part. They're covered in a waterproof material, and then they're actually glued using surgical glue to the fur over the rump of the animal. And then they just, the advantage of that is that there's no way that the tags can get snagged on things as would occur in the case of a harness or a collar. You can then track the animals using a handheld receiver and aerial and find out precisely where their burrows are located and where they mainly spend time feeding. These sorts of studies have now been conducted in many different places and have provided us with a pretty good idea of where platypus prefer to spend their time and generally what those kind of conditions are. So later on, Richard will be speaking in detail about what the platypus eats. So for now, I'll just mention that their diet mainly consists of small aquatic insects and other aquatic invertebrates. They rarely feed on fish, only the very smallest kind of fish, because they lack true teeth. There are grinding pads at the back of the bill, but they can't actually capture things using their teeth. So to find its prey, the platypus can zigzag back and forth across shallow riffles. It can search for food under banks, sometimes by digging for worms and that sort of thing. But by far the commonest way that a platypus forages is to dive to the bottom of the channel to search for the invertebrates that hide there. Now, if you're ever in a position to try to spot a platypus in the wild, this is what to look for. A platypus foraging dive, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, begins with an animal floating on the surface as it breathes, and it chews up all the bugs that it's collected on its previous dive. So that will typically take the animal about 10 to 15 seconds. And during that period, it will pretty much be floating in a single location, and to hold its position in the water, what it does is gently paddles using its front feet, which create those very characteristic bullseye ripple pattern around the animal. And that's the main thing that you'll normally notice. You won't see the animal. You can see they float very low in the water. From a distance, they look like a little floating stick more than anything else, with a little bit of a bump for the head and a little bit of a bump over the back of the body. But what is conspicuous is the bullseye ripple pattern. Then when the animal has finished breathing and chewing up its food, it does a neat little duck dive as shown by the middle slide there, the middle image there. You normally won't hear any noise at all unless the animal is frightened, when there'll be a bit of a splash, but it'll just go underwater and creating more, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, a very conspicuous ripple pattern as it dives. With sometimes, if you have a very good view, you'll see the little bubbles that come to the surface as air is squeezed out of the animal's fur. A platypus normally then remains underwater for 30 to 60 seconds, and then it pops back up to the surface again, normally within about 20 meters of where it first, where you saw it previously. Now, just for the sake of completeness, I thought you might also like to see what a platypus looks like when it swims from point A to point B. And when traveling, the animals do remain on the surface. The reason probably is so that they can breathe continuously as they're exerting themselves. They only swim using their front feet. They're quite unusual animals that way. And as they're paddling, and because it's their front feet only, they create a very prominent bow wave, as you can see in front of the animal's head, extending back as a V. I mean, the animals are basically, the back feet are only being used to help steer as it goes along. So it's very much a motion that is being carried on by the front feet there. Now, the best place to see a platypus is when the water is in any place where the water is still, where the ripples will show up. And in terms of where your location is, the optimum thing is to be a bit above the water, not just right down on the bank, but a little above it, the top of the bank, because the ripples tend to show up much better that way. The best time of day to see a platypus is very early in the morning or late in the evening, because the animals are mainly out feeding at night, but their activity will extend out into the daylight hours, but mainly early or late in the day. And the best time of year to see the platypus is typically in late winter through the spring, because this coincides with the platypus breeding season. And so the animals are more active then than they are at any other time of the year. Now, returning to the topic of platypus habitat preferences, I want to quickly run through 6 factors that contribute to platypus heaven. So these are all things that the platypus responds to very positively in its environment. And habitat factor 1 is reliable surface water. This is not too surprising. The platypus is adapted to feed only in the water. And if water disappears from an area, a platypus will either have to leave or it will starve to death. During extended drought, the animals can survive for a bit of time in remnant pools, as shown in the bottom right there, which is a pool that was left during the Millennium Drought. Many rivers actually look this way, and a lot of platypus did die in the course of the Millennium Drought because of loss of surface water. The problem is not only that there's not very much food in a little pool like that, but also if the animals have to move between pools to try to find enough food, they become very vulnerable to being killed by predators such as foxes or birds of prey. Okay, the second factor contributing to platypus heaven is the presence of pools or other slow-moving water. And although a platypus can feed successfully in habitats where flow is rapid, the animals generally prefer to spend most of their time, if there is still water, that's where they mainly like to feed. And this is thought to at least partly reflect the fact that bugs are easier to detect and to grab when the water is still. Obviously, it's easier to catch something if it's kind of stays in place after you found it, rather than having the current, pushing it downstream. So from a platypus's point of view, pools are great, but they don't want them to be too deep, because then they have to expend more energy to swim down to the bottom. So ideally, a depth of about 1 to 4 meters, extending up to perhaps as much as 5 or 6 meters is the sort of depth they like. All right, habitat factor 3 then for platypus heaven is lots of organic material in the water, and plants on the banks drop branches, twigs, and dead leaves in the water, which are all important platypus habitat factors. And they provide, obviously, this is one of my favorite pictures ever of a platypus. This little guy is scratching his back on woody debris there at the right. But beyond that, all of this organic material, it provides a basis for the food chain in the water which the platypus is at the top of. And it also provides a place, because it concentrates, there's a lot of macroinvertebrates that are eating organic materials, or they attach themselves to organic materials like branches in the water. These are places where the platypus can be confident there's a lot of food. And so they actually act as locations where they can home in on their invertebrates quite efficiently. So they act in a sense as refrigerators. They're a place that concentrate food, and the platypus can be confident it's there. Okay, apart from the organic stuff in the water, it's also very important that there's vegetation on the surrounding banks. This is obviously the source of the logs and large branches and so forth that's in the water, but they're also important in their own right. They stabilize the banks, which are a critical thing for platypus burrows, and also vegetation that overhangs the water like this. It provides a very important place for platypus to have their burrows, stable banks where their burrows can be protected from erosion. And the other thing, of course, is that because vegetation, when it overhangs the water, it shades the water. This helps to keep the water cool in summer. And that's an important thing for maintaining dissolved oxygen levels that is needed by all the bugs that the platypus eats. Okay, along the fifth platypus heaven factor is pebbles, cobbles, and rocks in the water. So the larger mineral substrates. And the importance of this is thought to be that, again, it contributes to improved foraging because it provides better conditions. It provides a more diverse and preferred conditions for invertebrates, for the platypus's food supply. Okay, the last factor contributing to platypus heaven are what's called stably undercut banks. And you can see this, how this develops is that plant roots on the banks, just below the level where they're stabilizing the soil, the water can gradually cut back underneath those roots to provide spaces under the banks. These areas are quite stable. They are not very susceptible. They erode slowly, but it's not something that destabilizes the banks. And it actually provides very important places for things like little bugs to live. It's a specialized habitat, but a very good one. On top of that, it also provides, as you can see in the picture at the right there, a very good protected location where a platypus can go. If it happens to see a predator, that's a place where it can hide. I suspect, I didn't take this photo, but I suspect that little guy was actually probably hiding from the photographer when his picture was taken. And it also provides a really great, we know from radio tracking, the platypus burrow entrances are very often undercut banks like that. It provides this little protected portico where a platypus can come out from its burrow and look around and make sure the conditions are safe before it comes out into the water to feed. Okay, so the key question really, I mean, we now have a good idea of what the platypus needs in terms of its habitat, but what can we do as humans to improve things to ensure that the platypus has what it requires to live on happily into the future? And there are some people that are fortunate enough to own land with river frontage, and they obviously have something special to contribute to this by fencing off banks to limit livestock access and encouraging trees and shrubs to grow there to provide the stuff that the platypus needs. If you're not in a position to have property along a waterway, you can still contribute though, because there are lots of community groups these days that are making a real difference to stream and river health by restoring native vegetation along waterways, controlling weeds, and then replanting with native vegetation. And lastly, no matter where you live, it makes sense to be frugal with your use of water, leaving more available for wildlife. So thank you for listening to part one.
Thank you so much, Melody. What a fascinating animal, and fascinating to get more greater insight into what they need for platypus heaven. I would now like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Richard Marchant is a stream ecologist who's worked at Museums Victoria since 1981, researching aquatic insects that spend at least part of their life cycle on the bottom of streams. Over many years, he's built up a picture of this diverse fauna and how it varies throughout Victoria, but also how these animals can be used to indicate water quality, whether there's pollution or other disturbance in the water. He's also done work in southern New South Wales, including studies near Braidwood, focusing on the animals which are platypus food, and that is what we'll hear about today. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Kate. So what we know already about platypus, we actually know something about what the platypus does eat. As Melody suggested, platypus feed essentially exclusively on benthic invertebrates on the bottom of the stream bed. These animals are quite well known, but there are all sorts of unknown aspects of them that we still need to find out about if we're going to be able to say something about how beneficial these animals are, and how many or how much is available for the platypus. If we want to characterize the suitability of a habitat for a platypus, we need to know not only the sorts of aspects that Melody was talking about, but we also need to know how many invertebrates are on the bottom, because that'll be the only way in which we can tell whether there's sufficient food for the platypus to survive. Now, up until recently, there's been no attempt to link what they eat with how much is available. And so the study that I'm going to talk to you about was an attempt to try and explore this link, and to determine, perhaps, if we were successful in exploring the link, whether to be able to determine the number of platypus that could be supported by a given length of river. Now, I conducted this work in the Upper Shoalhaven River in southern New South Wales near Braidwood, as Kate mentioned. And the only way I could do this work, of course, was with my colleague Tom Grant, who's been working at this site for almost 50 years. Now, the Upper Shoalhaven River is a very typical river in southern New South Wales and on the southern tablelands. As you can see here, these are two pictures of the main pool where we worked. It's a pool habitat, just like Melody was suggesting. This was a good habitat for platypus, but you can see it's surrounded by farmland rather than native forest. On the photograph on the right, you can see that at least one bank of the river was really quite badly eroded, but still, this was a good habitat for platypus. As I said, it's about 250 kilometers south of Sydney, and here are two other views of the area where we sampled. Again, on the bottom photograph, the bottom right photograph, you can see some of the erosion on the far bank, and also the presence of wombat burrows, which I'll come back to in a while. The top picture gives you an idea of the bottom pool that we were interested in, and I think the next picture will show you an enlargement of that. Yeah, this is Tom Grant on the right-hand side with one of his colleagues, and he's laying out a net to trap platypus. So what Tom would do is, because the platypus are essentially only active from dusk till dawn, is that they would lay out nets late in the afternoon and sit and wait in their boat for platypus to become trapped in the net. The minute they could see a platypus struggling in a net, they would rush over, grab the platypus, and the first thing they would do, from the point of view of trying to find out what the animal has been eating, is to scrape out the contents of its cheek pouches. Now, as Melody suggested, the platypus doesn't have teeth. It has grinding plates in its bill, and also in its bill it has a pair of what we call cheek pouches. The invertebrates that it's found on the bottom are stored in the cheek pouches, and when it comes to the surface, it then chews up this food, swallows it, and dives again. What Tom was trying to do was intervene in this process, catch the platypus when it is on the surface, pull it into the boat, and he had a nice little instrument that he developed over several years, which would effectively scrape out material from the cheek pouches, which he would then preserve in a vial and send to me for identification. So the study we did began in 2008, finished at the end of 2009. We were able to trap platypus on 7 separate occasions for this assessment. We were eventually, or in total, we were able to get the contents of 62 platypus, or 62 pairs of cheek pouches. And to give you some idea of the sorts of animals we were finding there, I've illustrated some of these along the side here as pictures, but the percentages refer to the percentage of the 62 platypus. So the mayflies, for instance, which are a common freshwater insect, the scientific term is Ephemeroptera, were found in 61 of these platypus. The caddisflies were found in 74. Midge larvae were found in 37%. Dragonfly larvae, and there's a picture on the bottom of a dragonfly larvae, were found in 60% of the platypus. Finally, we found some beetles in 36%, and also some very small bivalves in 19% of the platypus. Just to show you a little bit more of what some of these animals might look like, here's a photograph of another mayfly that was common on the riverbed where we were doing the work. As you can see, it's very well camouflaged against the bottom and probably wouldn't be exposed like this in most circumstances. It would probably be just hiding under rocks or inconspicuous anyway. The midge larvae that I referred to are small animals, but are very abundant in fresh water. They're often the most diverse and abundant freshwater insect you can find in any freshwater habitat. They're long, the larvae, I should say, are long, thin animals, a bit like worms, but they're a very important source of food for many animals in rivers and streams. Finally, here's a picture of some of the bivalves. I'm afraid it's a rather blurry picture, but I've put it in to show you just how small some of these things are. The scale at the bottom is in millimeters, and you can see that each of these little bivalves is only from about 2 to 3 millimeters in diameter. So these are small animals, but these are all capable of being collected quite efficiently by the platypus. And so what I wanted to do is to try and figure out exactly how much of this material was available on the bottom. So as you can see here, this wasn't an easy task. For a start, the bottom of the river is incredibly stony, as you can see on the bottom right-hand picture. And the only efficient way to sample a habitat like this was literally to suck the material out. And this large white pipe that I'm holding in the left-hand photograph does exactly that. It's a device called an airlift sampler, and it uses compressed air from the tank on the back of the diver to cause a current of water to rise up through the tube into the bag that you can see hanging off the left-hand end of the device. And this sucks up material into the bag. So when we were conducting the study, we would take 10 samples on each visit, and we made a number of visits 6 visits in 2009 and somewhat fewer in 2011. We couldn't work in the year between, not efficiently. In fact, we did a couple of samples in 2010, but many of you will remember that in 2009, it was a drought. The drought broke at the beginning of 2010, and we had a series of quite large floods during 2010, which made it impossible to do any diving work in the river. Now what I want to show you,
this is the Upper Shoalhaven
I hope,
site where I've been looking at Platypus Diet with my colleague Tom Grant.
it's just a little video.
Many platypus biology. This is a series of long, quite deep pools, up to 3 meters deep, and consequently, to look at the diet of the platypus, one needs to sample the bottom of the pools where they feed, and this can only be done by diving. You can see that the pools are very rocky, but they harbour interesting animals such as these dragonflies, freshwater mussels, and mayflies, and these are all part of the diet of the platypus. What I'm trying to do here is get some information on the actual densities of these animals on the bottom. Tom, in the past, 30 years ago, did an excellent study of what the platypus ate, but the missing part of the picture is what is available, how much is available to the platypus. And this is what I'm trying to do by collecting quantitative data from a square quadrat like this on the bottom of the river. By sampling such a quadrat at various spots on the river, I can build up a picture of the density of many of the potential prey items. From that sort of data, I can get an idea of what we call the production of aquatic insects and other invertebrates on the bottom of the river. And we can match this with the known energy requirements of the platypus. One of the ultimate aims of the whole project is to try and determine how many platypus can be supported by a given length of river. Here I'm just processing the sample that's been taken underwater on the banks and examining the material under the microscope.
So that gives you some idea of what I had to go through to take the samples. It looks a bit difficult, but in fact it turned out to be a lot easier than it actually appears. But the bulk of the work, of course, in a project like this is not so much taking material in the field or capturing animals in the field, but examining them back in the laboratory under a microscope, which is a long, tedious business. Anyway, I was able to, from the samples I'd taken, I was able to acquire data on the density and the size of the animals for 21 common species. And from these data, I could calculate things such as growth and biomass. And biomass is just the weight of material, weight of insects, if you like, on the bottom of the stream. Now, I mentioned before in the video that one of the variables I calculated from this data is what is called production. Production is the amount of tissue that is produced each year by a species. And it is quite analogous or comparable, if you like, to the yield from a crop grown over a given period. It's not calculated in the same way as you would calculate the yield of a crop, but the calculations aren't that different, but they're tailored to the life cycle of the actual animals involved. So those are the data I tried to develop and I was able to obtain. And just to give you some idea of what the results were like, here are results of production for the 2 years. The first year is shown in black and the second year is shown in white. Along the bottom, along the x-axis, you can see the different types of invertebrates, and on the y-axis, you can see the actual amounts. Now, you must remember that on the y-axis here, this isn't an arithmetic scale, it's what we call a logarithmic scale. And I've done it this way just so that you can get some idea of everything that's present. If I'd done it on an arithmetic scale, things like the bivalves and the dragonflies would not really be that visible compared with the others. But what is obvious is that in the first year, the midge larvae were by far the most densely, were by far the most productive group of animals on the bottom, followed by the mayflies and the caddisflies. The dragonflies and the bivalves produced a lot less tissue each year, and the beetles produced so little I couldn't even show it on this graph. In the second year, after we've had some good flows, the production levels of both the dragonflies and the bivalves had hardly been affected at all, but you can see that the midge production is somewhat lower than it was in the first year, but for the mayflies and the caddisflies, the production levels have gone up almost by an order of magnitude. And this is largely because the pool habitat where I was working accumulated lots of organic material, exactly the sort of material that Melody was talking about, that lines the banks of the river or falls into the river. A pool habitat, of course, is an excellent place for depositing material. This material is actively fed upon by things like caddisflies and mayflies, and thus their production levels increased. So with these data on production, the next thing we could do is try and compare these data with what the known metabolic requirements of the platypus. Now, the metabolic requirements of the platypus are expressed in energy units, and the levels of production of the invertebrates can also be expressed in energy units. And when we do this sort of comparison, we were able to determine that based on the availability of food, taking into account the metabolic requirements of an average platypus, that in the Shoalhaven River, the river itself could support 17.9 platypus per kilometer. Once I'd finished this study with Tom, he then, with some colleagues of his, used data that he'd collected on marked individuals through over 40 years of monitoring to determine the average numbers of platypus he had detected over that period. And that calculation turned out to be 19.3 platypus per kilometer. So you can see these figures are quite close together. They're pretty similar to each other, and it gives you gave us some confidence that the data we were producing on the productivity of the food that was available for the platypus made some sense in the context of where we were studying it. Now, just to go back a little bit, as I said at the beginning, the area where we were working was farmland. You can see here a better picture of the far bank of the river. It's clearly eroded. The farmer on that side of the river would allow his cattle to wander down the bank and even wander into the river and onto our side, or the side I'm standing on. As you can see, there are also obvious wombat burrows present on his side of the river and on the side that I'm standing on. These were in fact quite a hazard. When I was doing this work, we were often had to fill out forms to do this field work and have to indicate what the main hazard was. And some people might have thought the main hazard was diving itself, but that was quite easy. The main hazard was walking around with heavy diving gear and trying not to fall into a wombat hole. Anyway, we didn't, so we were fine. But the interesting thing, I think, of this study, or one of the interesting features is, as I said earlier, the farmland where we were doing the work was entirely characteristic of the southern tablelands of New South Wales and has undergone land clearing, erosion, removal of streamside vegetation. But despite all these insults, there is still productive foraging habitat for the platypus. And Tom's own monitoring work has shown that platypus have been continually present for at least 4 decades at these sites, or at this site and other sites upstream and downstream of where we were working on the Shoalhaven. So undoubtedly, the nature and the composition of the available food of the insects, if you like, has changed since this whole landscape has been settled by farmers and by Europeans. But there is still productive foraging habitat for the platypus. People are very inclined to take one look at these sorts of streams and say, oh, well, there's nothing there. It's a hopeless situation. But in fact, there's lots of good biological quality in some of these places. And as you can see, we were surprised at the number of platypus that could be supported in a river like this one. Thank you very much for listening.
I have just a few last slides following on from what has been spoken about so far. And I wanted to highlight for everyone, because I think this is a really important issue. It's different than the issues surrounding the platypus's food supply that we've been speaking about, but it has to do with the fact that litter, this is something that's really important because people can address it. So, I mean, it's the issue of how litter affects the platypus. The issue is particularly a problem for the platypus because of the fact that these guys feed, as you now know, mainly on the bottom, which is precisely where litter accumulates in the environment. Now, and then what happens is that the animals are swimming along as they're searching for food on the bottom. They get things, loops of things around their head, and it can work its way back through their, back around their neck, and then even farther, if it's a big enough loop, farther back, if it's stretchy enough, farther back along their body. And the animals have real trouble getting it off. And the reason is that the platypus's front foot, as you can see here, is a very, very specialized structure. They are highly adapted to paddle to help the animal swim, but they end in this really big expanded web of skin that unfurls in the water. It's basically this really large paddling surface, but it's absolutely hopeless at grabbing at things or being able to manipulate things. The platypus literally cannot grab something that's around its neck and pull it off. The feet cannot do it. So what the platypus does in nature to keep its fur in good nick, it actually grooms its fur using its back feet only. Now, which is fine. It can reach all parts of the body with its back feet, but the feet are not capable of grabbing something around the neck and pulling it far enough forward that it comes off, comes forward far enough to get around the bill. So once some kind of item is around the platypus's neck or body, it stays there until either it degrades naturally and falls off, or it or the platypus dies. I mean, it can be there for a very long time. And as the animal swims and moves around, these materials tend to rub against the skin, and eventually they wear through, and they can create horrifying, absolutely horrifying injuries. And in some cases, the animals will actually die. Now, it turns out here that virtually any ring or loop, anything that measures 10 to 25 centimeters in circumference, so that's the distance around the loop, has the potential to injure or kill a platypus. And over time, we have found the most amazingly wide variety of materials around these poor animals. I mean, we've had canning jar rings, we've had plastic tamper-proof jar seals, we had an elastic cuff from some kind of a wind cheater, many elastic hair ties, which are a real problem, a hospital identification bracelet, a circular metal fitting from a bicycle headlamp, a PVC offcut. I mean, here there's an engine gasket, as you can see here at the bottom. All of these things we have actually taken from the platypus bodies. In some cases, the animals haven't been hurt too badly because they haven't been around the animals long enough. But in other cases, there have been extremely serious injuries. Fishing line is another real big problem. In this case, you can see this is a juvenile male platypus that was found lying on the banks of a Tasmanian stream. It had been entangled. You can see the item here. It's a plastic bracelet, a little bangle that had been around the animal's neck, and that's how deeply it had cut over time. This animal was taken to a vet, and it probably survived. It was the vet took care, fixed it up, sutured up the wound, and it was put back in the river. And the vet thought that it would probably be able to survive. This guy, horrifyingly, I mean, this was a subadult male that was, again, it was found alive, if you can believe it, on the Werribee River in Werribee Township by someone who took it to Melbourne Zoo. It had been entangled in this is a gasket, so it's a fitting from an engine of some sort or some other sort of mechanism. It had gone from in front of one shoulder to behind the opposite leg. So it was like a bandolier, if you will, around the animal. So, and what it had done, this is behind the, where it had cut behind behind the leg. It had cut through the animal so deeply that you can actually see the bone. This white here is actually the upper leg bone of the animal that's been exposed. This animal was dying when it was found, and there was no way to save it. This animal did die. So what can people do to help? And I mean, this is a major issue, especially in terms of animal welfare. This is an animal that was found along Diamond Creek in Melbourne, and it had this wide plastic band around its neck. This had not cut into the animal yet, but eventually it would have done. And all of these things that we use commonly in our day-to-day lives, elastic hair ties are a real problem. They're just the right size to get caught from in front of a shoulder to behind the opposite leg, as we saw in that the animal that was caught in the gasket. And they can do real damage. They are both elastic, but they're also tough. They're meant to last long periods of time. And we think a lot of them are dropped when people are swimming. And so people go into the water, and then it just comes off their hair. It's sitting there. And we know of one juvenile female platypus that was found on the banks at Bright there were 3 elastic hair ties around the animal. It was starving to death. It was in incredibly bad shape. It had terrible wounds, and it had to be put down. There was nothing else to be done. Fishing line is another real problem because it's very tough. People will get a snag somewhere. They'll snag their line on a piece of wood or something, and they cut the line, and the snag remains in the water, and then a platypus comes along. It gets looped in the line, and the animal, it's very, very dangerous. So what can people do? 3 things. Please take these ideas on board and share them with whoever you can. People need to be really mindful to pick up litter. I know that COVID is, changing the way we're thinking about things, but if you see an item that could slip around a platypus's head or body, pick it up, dispose of it, and then wash your hands carefully afterwards. it's really something that's important. Also, spread the word. I mean, the more that people know about the relationship between litter and rubbish and platypus and other wildlife, it's not just platypuses suffer from these things, the more other people will do the right thing and not drop litter or pick it up. And in particular, people need to be aware of the fact that litter doesn't have to be along the banks of a stream or a river to be dangerous because of storm water drain. If a child drops something in a on a playground or in front of their house and it ends up in the storm water system, it just goes swoosh down to a river, and it's there to be a dangerous thing. And last but not least, everyone should get in the habit of cutting through. If you have a loop or a ring at home, even plastic milk bottle, the little basal rings of those can go around a platypus's bill. Elastic bands, any sort of material, even stuff like this could potentially be a problem. So just cut through all loops and rings before you dispose of them responsibly. Thank you very much. Do your bit and help, please.
Thank you so much, Melody. I'm going to get out my scissors right away and snip through anything before disposing of it. That's a very practical thing, but it also has made me think about local streams. I live fairly near the Diamond Creek, and just the value of having regular litter cleanups. We have some time for questions from the audience, and while we do that, I've also got a short poll. If people would be able to fill in that poll, that'll just give us a little bit of feedback as well. So I'll put that up and you can do that anytime over the next few minutes. There's been a few questions asking about the influence of floods, or the reverse, actually, where river flows are reduced or controlled. Could either of you talk a bit about those sort of the varying flows in rivers and how that affects platypus?
Richard, do you want?
Yes, I'd be happy to say something about that. Yes, it's often thought that varying flows will affect invertebrates and thus could affect the platypus. I think it depends on the size of the flows that we're talking about. Clearly, as Melody pointed out, if we go through a long drought period and the pools especially shrink in size, well, that's going to affect the number of platypus that can be supported. And there could well be starvation as a result of long or prolonged droughts. But it is remarkable how quickly the invertebrate fauna can return in large numbers once the river starts to flow to any extent. So I think it's still very much up in the air, the extent to which varying flow will actually have a major impact on platypus. Remember, platypus have been around for a long time, and the rivers in southern Australia are notoriously variable in flow. So my best guess would be that the platypus are pretty resilient at coping with varying flows.
And I'll just add, I mean, recently there's obviously been some very major flooding going on in the northern part of the platypus's range. We do know, and again, this is information that has been mainly gathered along the Shoalhaven River in this very long-term monitoring site that Tom Grant established, that if there's really major flooding, overbank flooding that occurs when the baby platypus are in burrows, which occurs mainly in December and January and perhaps into February, that can be a problem because the juveniles, they are well advanced, but they can't swim independently yet, and so they drown. If the water gets too high, they will drown in burrows, and it can lead to a major reduction in the amount of reproduction that succeeds in a given year. But once you get to into March and April, the juveniles they've come out by then and they're stronger. And it is likely that most of them, it is thought most of them will probably survive flooding for, a day or two or something like that. When there have been many major floods along the Shoalhaven, and what's been seen is that the animals sometimes disappear briefly, but then they reappear, and the old animals are captured again in the same pools where they were found beforehand. So in general, it's believed that platypus can survive floods pretty well.
Yeah, if I could add to that, when Tom and I were doing our cheek pouch survey of the platypus, one of the female platypus that we caught was 16 years old, according to Tom's records. And in fact, he caught it again after we finished the study when it was 20 years old. And he said to me, that's the oldest platypus he's ever handled. And yet, again, as Melody says, the Shoalhaven is a notorious place for flooding. And an animal like that that's lived for 20 years would have been subject to many floods over its lifetime.
Thank you both. We have another rather specific question here from Kylie Wireback about the young platypus. She asks, when young platypus leave their natal burrows, do they tend to disperse upstream, downstream, or leave the system entirely?
That is a very good question. And we have as researchers, we have a very long way to go before it's going to be perfectly answered. It's a very difficult one to answer. It's believed that the juveniles mainly leave in late autumn to early winter as conditions, and they're not actually, we had some data that indicates that the mothers don't actually push the babies out or anything like that. It's just that as it gets colder, the food supply starts to decline, and the babies they're not as good at foraging as the adults. And so they decide that it's going to be in their own best interest to leave and to try to find a place of their own where there's not as much competition. Now, as far as we can tell, there have been some recaptures that have been done over time. And in general, the animals that have been captured that were where they were marked as juveniles and later picked up as older animals, they've been picked up 40 to 50, in some cases 40 to 50 kilometers from where they originated. So these animals can move very long distances, and it's not, I'm sure that that's not the maximum. It's just that's the maximum kind of area where we've actually conducted studies to pick these things up. In general, it's been the case that the animals have moved upstream, and that's been fairly consistent. However, I kind of think that might be biased because in general, there tends to be more good quality habitat upstream in many waterways as compared to far down where it turns into salt water, so that it's more likely perhaps that we just notice whether we notice the animals there because of the fact there's more possibility that they integrate into the population. So we don't know, in other words, which direction they go, but if anything, there may be selection for them to go upstream as opposed to downstream.
Thanks, Melody. And a related question from Brioni Webb is, what was the range limit on the radio tracking device, and how long was it fitted to platypus?
The thing that limits how long it stays on is actually how fast the fur is molted. I mean, what happens is that the skin gets we shave a little circle of skin, and then the device is attached directly to the skin with surgical glue so that it doesn't irritate the fur. And then we glue the surrounding fur to it to kind of hold it in position and stabilize it. But as the fur molts, then that bond weakens, and it tends to be just, and then it falls off. Normally in a burrow, where the animal is grooming itself. So it depends a bit on the time of year, but it's typically, I would have said, in the worst case, it tends to be a couple of weeks, and in the best case, it tends to be perhaps as much as 2 months would probably be the longest. The range depends a lot on things like terrain and that sort of thing, but it can be up to about 1 kilometer.
Thank you. Liz Burtons asks, with regard to food sources for the platypus, do they have other competitors for the food identified? And if so, was that taken into account in the research?
Yes, that's a very good question. Yes, obviously the food that the platypus eat are not exclusively eaten by the platypus. There's plenty of fish and freshwater turtles and so on that'll eat exactly the same sorts of animals. But where we were working on the Upper Shoalhaven, the platypus was probably the major predator of the invertebrates in that long section of river. The altitude there was about 700 meters, and we know from fish surveys done by the New South Wales Fisheries Authority that at that sort of altitude, the only fish you commonly find are brown trout, an introduced species, of course, and two species of eels, the long-finned and the short-finned eels. In the 40 years or so, 45 years that Tom has been trapping platypus in that part of the Shoalhaven River, it was only in the first 10 years in the 1970s that he actually used to catch any fish in his nets, mostly trout. And that was a period of very high flows, especially in the middle of the 1970s. And his opinion was that those were fish that were washed down from further upstream, which seems pretty likely. But since the mid-1990s, I think he's caught one fish in that time. So yes, the short answer is other animals can compete with the platypus for the invertebrates that are available, but the site where we were working, at least when we were working there in 2009 and 2011, or 2009, 2010, 2011, platypus were probably the only predator present.
Now, I've got another question, which is more about the riverbank rejuvenation. I'm not sure whether this is something that you can comment on, Melody, but Catriona McMillan asks, are there any native tree species in particular that are suitable for riverbank rejuvenation? And are there any other resources that you would recommend for riverbank weed removal?
That's a very good question. And there's no really easy single answer to that because it depends on where you are. And I'm myself not a vegetation expert, so I'm probably not the right one to give specific advice. If you're in the Melbourne area, I suggest that you might want to contact, well, if there is a local community group, a friends group or something like that, that is active in your area, get in touch with them because they'll almost for sure know the answer to that. But also you can contact agencies like Melbourne Water, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, DELP, the catchment management authorities in regional Victoria, land care, if you have a land care group. I mean, any of these sorts of agencies and groups would be the ones to go to. And there is very good information about that, but you really need to check for your area.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think what Melody said is exactly right. It'll depend on where you are. The authorities in Victoria for a long time have tried to remove invaded or introduced species from riverbanks, such as willows, for instance. And this can be quite successful, but generally in my experience, they've replaced them with fast-growing trees like acacias, which have a limited lifespan. And some of the rivers that I investigated when I was first at the museum in the early 1980s, they removed all the willows, they replanted the banks with acacias, and I came back and looked at these rivers 25, 30 years later, and there are still willows there. And I asked what was going on, and they said, well, the acacias all died off. The willows, of course, you can't exterminate, at least not readily. So the minute the acacia starts dying, the willows start coming back. And again, they've got to go through the whole cycle again of knocking down the willows and replacing them with native vegetation. Many people dislike the fact that willows line many of our rivers. It's unfortunate. And others try and make the case that they're actually physically harmful or biologically harmful as well to river communities of invertebrates, for instance. Yes, you can find different communities of invertebrates under willow trees than you will find under native species of tree. But the densities and the biomass, I think, are probably pretty comparable. So from the platypus's point of view, as long as the bank is stabilized, like Melody was emphasizing earlier on, so that they can make their burrows and that the sufficient amounts of organic material fall into the river. I think those are the main factors to keep in mind.
We've got some wonderful questions. I think we maybe have time just for a couple more. Here's one about, if you'd like to comment about the differences between platypuses in different areas, from northern areas of Australia as compared to Tasmania.
So a question, I presume that this refers to whether how they differ. There's no subspecies that are recognized in the platypus now. That's all considered to be the same species over the entire range. And this partly reflects the fact that the animals, the color and the shape of the animal and its general behavior and how often they breed and all that sort of thing seems to be fairly constant across the range. So it's a single species. The main difference that you note is that the animals are smaller at the northern end of the range in Queensland. They get progressively larger as you go south, and then the biggest animals are found in Tasmania. This is a very common pattern in mammals, and it reflects the fact that in colder conditions, it is advantageous to be larger because you have your surface area is smaller relative to your core area, and so you can retain heat better. And so that's believed to be the main factor. But other than that, they're pretty much the same.
Okay. Richard, we have a question here about over the 4 decades of studying the community and abundance of macroinvertebrates. Did you notice any change in that as other habitat variables changed? For example, loss of stable banks, loss of vegetation, overhanging. Was there any kind of discernible pattern in terms of how these things changed?
There is a pattern. Just let me correct one thing though. I didn't study the invertebrates at the Shoalhaven for 4 decades. If I'd have been doing that, I'd have done nothing else in my life. No, I was only studying them there for essentially 3 years. But my wider work in Victoria and New South Wales and elsewhere, and the work of many other people has shown that, yes, these invertebrate communities are really quite sensitive to what we might term changes in land use. We clearly know that invertebrate communities vary, stream invertebrate communities vary the minute you start polluting rivers with toxins or large amounts of nutrients or something like that, or poisonous materials such as heavy metals, which can be leached from the soil. But those are obvious effects. The effects of changes in land use or gradual changes in land use are perhaps more subtle, but still it is really quite obvious that land use itself is a major factor influencing the composition and distribution of these animals. In Victoria, for instance, where we have essentially, I think it's about 27 or 28 officially recognized catchment regions, there's a very clear relationship between the number of species in each of these regions and the degree of clearing of native vegetation. So in the catchments with the most amount of remaining native vegetation, you get the highest diversities, and in the catchments where most of the native vegetation has been cleared, and a good example of that would be the Hopkins catchment in southwestern Victoria, you get the lowest diversities of invertebrates. So yes, land use is a major factor in the biodiversity of this community.
And if I could just, although I'm not a macroinvertebrate person, just in terms of the platypus itself, it's interesting that the Shoalhaven, as Richard said, the Shoalhaven does provide a very good habitat for the platypus. And I think that reflects the fact, you can see, following on from my discussion of the various factors, you can see, I mean, the Shoalhaven offers the animals these large, extensive pools. It has very reliable water, although it does fluctuate. The pools remained right through the millennium drought. There was always refuge there for the animals. There is lots of large rocks and that sort of thing in the substrate. And although it has, it's certainly had depleted vegetation because of farming, there is still quite a lot of native vegetation. There are trees and so forth. What I would say is that, and all of those positive features have contributed to platypus remaining. What I would predict, though, is that if it were possible to fence off the the livestock from the water and improve conditions in terms of more shrubs, more trees, and thicker grass and that sort of thing along the banks, you would expect that that would be reflected in higher numbers of platypus, and that would be something that the animals do respond to the invertebrates, and the invertebrates respond to the habitat. So there's a linkage there. If you can get the conditions right, you're likely to see, we strongly predict that there'll be more platypus in the future.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have time for. Thank you for all your questions from the audience, and I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to answer your specific one. We will be putting up a story about the platypus based on the work of Melody and Richard and other people onto our website. So keep an eye out for that one. So thank you very much to our speakers. It's been fabulous.